Hello and welcome back to Literally Literary. If this is your first time joining us, be sure to check out our previous episodes. This episode, we will continue our discussion on Citizen Illegal by José Olivarez. Last episode, we continued the discussion, focusing on some of our favorites from the first two sections. This episode, we will focus on the third section of the collection.
Yo.
Cool. So section 3 is a section we wanted to look at in isolation instead of just looking at two sections. Because I think it does have a lot in it. And it kind of, to me, it kind of represents a turning point for the collection.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you guys see, but...
yeah, I mean, I think I think as we were saying in the show before the show, the pre-show discussion, this section definitely has poems that are tightly packed, and I think have a lot to unravel and that's worthy of discussion. It gets very overtly political, I think in terms of race and ethnicity, nationality. So, yeah, definitely a lot to dive into for this section.
Yeah. And we wanted to start off with Mexican Heaven, since not only is that the first one, but I think, for Mexican Heaven, in and of itself, right, it kind of represents its own turning point. But even just looking at the first one, Vanessa, what did you think of the first Mexican Heaven in here?
I think it's very representative of, I think the stereotypical way that people see Hispanics and Mexicans particularly.
How so?
Well, it's focusing on the idea that in order to get into heaven, it's to work. And I think that ties back into what we were talking about last episode, where heaven kind of represents America.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of in order for the Mexicans to get into heaven, they have to work.
Mm-hmm. And work hard at it, that idea of like you were saying about America representing heaven. Like if you work hard, you'll not just get into the US, but achieve the American dream.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of interesting how it's kind of represented as a fantasy. And it's kind of that idea of the last two lines there of might, implying that it's not necessarily the case that that's going to happen, right? It's the dream.
Yeah, it's not a guarantee.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think this poem is a great intro piece for this entire section. I feel like it's a microcosm of that discussion of the Mexican labor and again, like you said, the Mexican dream. What does it mean? What does it entail? Jose later on draws some really great lines about this connection in some of the later poems.
And St. Peter again, right? It's kind of we were talking about last time. It's kind of like the immigration agent who decides, who goes in, who doesn't.
Right.
And just like you were saying, Vanessa, about, and you all were saying about Mexican labor, it's well, they get in, but they're going to be working, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, it kind of another subversion of what we think of as heaven. And, especially right now when there's going to be a lot of virtual Zoom, Easter celebrations for a lot of Catholics, or, the Passover for others, is, that it's still something that doesn't seem much different from, the real world. Anything else about this one, Vanessa?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, the next one right after on 29, the day my little brother gets accepted into grad school, to me was the one in this section that stood out to me a lot. I really like what Jose, or the speaker, I should say, did here with the way that the story of his brother is told and narrated. and ultimately comes around, with like it's very well bookended. Um, and the way it starts in the second stanza with the idea of the little brother, throwing the cap and fluttering like a bird, with a broken wing, and it's just kind of the tragedy of, or it, not tragedy, but it's tragic, right? And it's sad that like when that lands, my brother was still broken, unemployed. And so that was for graduating from college. And, the way that they celebrate is very subdued, just a toast and very meek. And then in the second to last stanza, uh, my straw lines there were where it says, "My brother is going to grad school. Another promise. The familiar fluttering." Again, referencing back the fluttering of that bird in the beginning. Um, and it kind of ties in with Mexican Heaven, because it's that idea of the American dream, but the American dream is realized by Mexican Americans or immigrants, of how they're graduating, they're being it's success, but it's still something that doesn't necessarily lead to opportunities.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with your assessment there, Jorge. Those were in fact some of the lines I drew on as well, and really again just kind of the contrast between the dream and the reality. Again, dream referring to American dream, what you can make yourself. Ideally, grad school is this idea, or just graduating college, right? Is supposed to be this big goal, but the reality for so many people is what's said here, right? Broke and unemployed. Then you also talk about amidst their celebration, it is very muted, right? And you also have in the backdrop of a city going through economic hardships. Or as he says, it's being razed, and the steel mills closing and foreclosures, and this is the landscape in which we're trying to achieve our dream.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned there about the environmental background of the city, to me, kind of could represent. I mean, we talked about gentrification before, but I think this could also be like a white flight of the white population moving out, and therefore that leading to a loss of like the businesses, right? Because they're shutting down whatever they had. They're moving their businesses elsewhere. It's very common in cities like Detroit and other cities. Maybe I mean, I don't know too much about Chicago, but kind of that same reality, right? Of like it either becomes gentrified, or because of the white flight, um, they end up being very impoverished, and the schools don't get enough taxes and things like that. That causes a lot of economic disruption. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting too.
Yeah, this one resonated with me a lot.
Yeah, and also that it's grad school. I think grad school like is even more exclusive. So it's kind of interesting that the little brother here, the acceptance comes, and it's still something that hasn't. We don't really get the results of that, unlike the graduating from college. But it's kind of represents that, well, they don't have a job, and so they're going to look at another opportunity through higher, a master's.
Yeah, I also like how he refers to social media, or in this case, he calls Facebook, and he likens it to a digital block. In other words, that's where our community is and can be. So when he shares the good news, you have obviously everyone flocking to give praise, imaginary flowers. And I like the way that that's set up, almost like this fake world, right? And in the end, you have like the reality, right, of the vacant lot and the weeds and ordinary grounds and no magic. It's an interesting like trajectory of the poem.
Yeah, that is interesting. Had it? Yeah, I mean that's a good contrast. Vanessa, did it strike you like any sort of lines from it?
Um, well, I think I interpreted it differently than you guys did because you said, well, when you mentioned the toast, you kind of said that it was like a minimal thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when I read it, I kind of saw it as like the parents are like celebrating it and it's like this party kind of thing that they're having. And it's like all of this praise and all of this like joy that they're experiencing, but he still can't even afford a Happy Meal. Like he still hasn't even really completed what he's trying to do.
Right.
But they're still praising him like, you've done it, you've made it. You know what I mean?
Right.
That's kind of how I saw it.
Well, there's still like the straining because they're praying too, right? I like the way, and you know, they are celebrating. Yeah, absolutely. Having some drinks, and I even like the humor infused in a little bit, and like mom drinks when God blinks. You know, like
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, that's a good point. They are.
Yeah.
It's important to be able to celebrate as well.
Yeah, and then I think the steel mail is something of the dad working in it is something we see in another, I think, a couple other poems. So it's kind of interesting how, from a narrative perspective, this is a poem that we see in different places in other poems.
Yeah,
yeah, because I think I walk into every room and yell where the Mexicans at.
Love that
31 is that one goes into the fathers and the working class
which
background that he has.
Again, that opening poem of Mexican Heaven, another reference to of the labor.
Exactly. But before we get to that one, I think we all liked I Tried to Be a Good Mexican Son on 30. And Vanessa, I remember you had asked Jose about this one. So I was wondering what is it that drew you to this one?
I like this whole idea of like what the expectations are when you're like a first gen in America. And it's a lot like it's kind of what we talked about a lot, focusing on I'm not your perfect Mexican daughter. So I kind of just saw the connection between those two. And I thought it was very different in what is expected of a son in comparison to the daughter.
Yeah.
Like the first line of this poem is, I even went to college. And in comparison to Erika's book, she's not expected to go to college. She's expected to stay at home. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting in terms of the prescribed gender roles that's different for sons than it is for daughters. And it's kind of interesting that both of these are also set in Chicago. And even if Chicago is more in the background in this one, what else did you think about that in terms of the way? What does it mean to be a good Mexican son? Then, would you say that like so when it seems like there's an expectation of college, but like also a certain degree, and even like the language he's speaking, his religiousness also.
And I also think that it's like this expectation of like he's supposed to be the one having this $1 million job, and like he's supposed to be having grandkids for his mom. It's just a very different expectation, I think.
And were there lines in particular that you wanted to highlight?
Well, I underlined went to a good college and learned depression isn't just for white people. And then I also underlined sometimes my mom's texts get dusty before I answer.
Why did you I underlined the first one that you mentioned too, but why those in particular?
I think the depression one, because a lot of people like, especially like going to therapy and all of those, like that type of thing is considered like a white people thing, and people of color typically don't. So I think it's interesting that he mentioned that it's not just because like everyone is capable of experiencing these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, if you all remember the poem about the therapist, right, that we covered last time, kind of touched. I like the intertextuality of this collection a lot. How like one thing you see in one poem, you see in a different way in another. And but yeah, you really hit the nail on the head there in terms of the expectations, not just of being a son, but of being Mexican. And how he's kind of carving out his own territory by seeking out help, for something that is considered part of white culture.
Mm-hmm.
Richie, what did you think?
I mean, I really liked this one as well. One of the questions that I didn't really get to ask when we talked to Jose is how his parents felt about the fact that he wanted to, he went into, literature writing, right? And so the speaker in this one, right, also he starts off with, I studied African American studies, right? It talks about that, right? Which isn't the law or the medicine or the business, which I think has already that connotation of again, what are your parents' expectations of you, and the poems filled with them. What are the expectations, and overall the you see the growing cultural gap between generations, right? And of course, there's just a lot of stuff that we identify. I think here, at least culturally, from the every time he comes back, does he have the $1 million job or grandkids, despite the widening gap, of how he feels kind of guilty about these things, enough to write about it in the sense of speaker. In the end, you still have the comfort of mom's home cooked beans, that concern of, you look skinny, and that's also something a lot of us can identify with is how to sit down for a good second and leave before a bad one.
Yeah, and I also like the aside from the what you mentioned about the family support that is still there regardless, like in the second line how it ends with my mom still loved me. I also like in the bottom half where it says Spanish deteriorating, English getting more vulgar. And what you said, Vanessa, at the beginning about being a first gen immigrant is I think very true with those lines, because it's what happens a lot, right, is just like with Julia and others that we've covered, is a lot of immigrants lose those attachments to their home, and part of that is through the language. And so he's getting more street smart and exposed to vernacular English, but yet his connection to his Spanish is falling apart. And it's another sign of, again, that I think I almost feel like the good Mexican son is something that should be in quotation marks, kind of like a good man in a Flannery O'Connor sense, right? Of like, well, whatever you think is good is really kind of relative, because he's good, right? Like he's not, like he hasn't lost his attachment. It's just the way that he's still trying, right? And yet still kind of trying to keep up with the changes in the new world, America, that he's trying to balance both, basically.
Man, there's that word again, balance.
Yeah. Yeah, because we've talked about that before, right? In his other poems, I think.
Yeah, definitely in the previous episodes, for sure.
Did any of you have the next one then, that I walk into every
Hell
woman?
Yeah, I do.
And yeah, where the Mexicans at?
Do you?
I had a line or two, but if you wanted to,
so again, every poem in this section is so packed, and that's one of the things I really I really appreciate about poetry, or this kind of form of expression, because there's so many images to unpack, and all of us come to our own understanding and meaning through that way. But here you also see the speaker dealing with again once again another juxtaposition of him socializing in a place he normally, again, he's trying to look for himself, right? And he talks about, again, the you mentioned the dad working at the steel mill, right? And how that kind of comes up in conversation during the party, and the way he discusses, I think it's very interesting the way we kind of speculate on people. That is, he mentions the way he describes the white women in this particular poem, right? There's a liberal white woman, and he says that she tells me she voted for Hillary and wishes Bernie won the nomination, which I think is an interesting thing to come up in conversation. And then you have this other lady.
Yeah.
Even though she doesn't bring up politics, he speculates she might have voted for Trump. Smiles how lucky I am. That's kind of like the line that is at the exterior of the poem, but in the interior, you have this kind of inner thought of again seeing it. How do people see him, right? And he mentions Taco Bell, every other commercial, and of course, as we know, Taco Bell isn't representative at all of authenticity when it comes to Mexican food, and so I really like the line when he says, "All my people fold into a $2 Crunchwrap Supreme." In other words, the way in which, and again, this kind of even goes to the opening poem, "Citizen Illegal." Even though it's not through language, it's through culture, through images, right? How we all perceive each other. And so he's looking for this identity, but he sees his dad singing a love song, kind of like a jaded love song, but he's singing it to America. It's like an illusion once again. And before that, I mean, there's a lot to break down. Like I said, here he is in New York City, and really the first person he kind of comes across that looks like him is the guy working the event, right? The waiter pushes through, carrying hors d'oeuvres, and even though he's not singing it, I a lot of us can enjoy the way a song escapes. Selena sings, "Por ay ay ay, como me duele," right? And the whole time you have this thing that the white woman says that's still hasn't been addressed, right? Where she says, "You're lucky," and it says, a good white woman waits for me to thank her." There's a lot to unpack with this one, and I think there's a very interesting. I think it's a reference to Narcissus, maybe. I don't know if there's any other parallel, right? But talking about how he stares in the mirror if he gets too lonely. That's like early on in the poem. It says, "I stare in the mirror if I get too lonely. Thirsty to see myself, I once walked into the lake until I almost drowned." But that's kind of maybe, because Narcissus is kind of, I think, another theme. But in this sense, again, he's looking for that connection of home, and what he's familiar with. Yeah. So anyway, this is another poem filled with contrasts and again, identity, how we see each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you made a lot of good points.
We talk
there.
a lot, huh?
So, no, I mean, I'll just, to me, even just the title, I think it speaks to the feeling of alienation that us immigrants, or those of us who are immigrants, or, not the majority, in other words, feel when we go somewhere, whether it be like a conference, and I know I've talked about that before, anywhere else but at Basel, and because you do want to feel like you're not the only one, and it's kind of, it reminded me, this poem reminded me of Get Out. The same way that he feels like, everyone's staring him down, because they were. because he's black
Mm-hmm.
and the protagonist. And here I see the white woman also as kind of the one who has the facade, of like they're liberal, but deep down, like because the vote is private, they're going to end up voting for Trump. And so the idea that you can't really trust them because of that, um, because they'll see one thing in public, but in private, they're really, doing something else that's supporting white supremacy.
Yeah, and also it's just kind of maybe leading into also to, again, that social fakeness that I mentioned in the previous poem of like kind of Facebook and, but here it's also that same thing, like social talk, polite conversation.
Yeah. And then with the dad, I like the invisible labor of like drive a car that goes and stops because of something my dad makes. So whether it's like car parts or like food, like agricultura, like all the crops and fruits and veggies, that immigrants raise, is all that invisible labor that the white population ends up, of course, benefiting from, but not recognizing. Vanessa, what did you think of this one?
I mean, I definitely feel like it's has that sense of like being homesick, that you guys kind of touched on. I like the line where it says that there's not too many Mexicans in this part of New York City. I wouldn't say that I like it. I like it, but I don't like it. It's just this whole idea of like, I think that you expect to find certain types of people in certain types of places. And so it just kind of really ties in this whole idea of like, he wants to be with his people, but he's here in this city where there's not a lot of his people.
Yeah, and kind of what also to add to that, what Richie said about, well, the only one who's there who's like him is the one who's just actually working there, right? The waiter. And again, it reminds me of Get Out, because if you guys have seen it, there's that scene where he approaches someone who's black at the gathering, because they have like a little celebration, and that other person is like all zombied out. He's like in the second place. And so it's a very awkward encounter, to say the least. But it kind of reminds me of that, because like you actually don't have someone to mingle with, because they're, in this case, they're working here. And I think lastly, the good white woman is a good contrast to the good Mexican son. Right. I don't know if that's intentional, but I think, here it's a much more ironic, good, like quote unquote, good white woman than it is in the other one of the good Mexican son.
Yeah.
Did any of you have Mexican American Obituary, the next one?
This one's pretty heavy as well. I just think talking about contemporary race politics, and not even contemporary, right? Because I think there's a lot of references to, once again, to the past of the U.S. indiscretions in terms of race relationships. That, of course, I think, again, we talk about slavery and treatment of indigenous Native Americans. In this case, you have the characters of Juan Lupe Lorena becoming American, their struggles, really. I think the line, serving crackers at a picnic while a strange wind swung through the branches carrying names. To me, that's just a reference to what I was speaking about right now. Again, you see the labor serving the white people. Again, he uses the derogatory term crackers, which, depending on your point of view, can be, funny or offensive. But but I think, there's a little bit of reference to maybe even lynching. I think of strange fruit when I read that line. Exactly, the strange wind swung through the branches. I think you see that ghosts haunting the lines of this poem, but it's not just a ghost; it's a reality, right? The constant killing of people of color, black neighbors and relatives, and also how it's not their fault. And he explicitly mentions this. Juan died saying it was none of his business. Lupe died believing their degrees would have saved them, or would save them. Lorena died after loading the gun and handing it over to the policeman who aimed it at her whole family. Um, Again, this is talking about something more systemic. And as I mentioned in the pre-show, these string of poems, I think, all build a crescendo to this second Mexican Heaven. But we'll get to that. But this one struck me as a very, very heavy and sad poem for these reasons.
Yeah, like you said, I mean, very, very dark in that regard because of the police violence and brutality that, you know, we've talked about with way back last November with Hate You Give. No, yeah, but I think, you know, you made a very good connection there to Strange Fruit. And I like also how the speaker here chooses not to capitalize Trump, you know, but does capitalize Juan Lupe and Lorena. Yeah. You know, I remember you, Vanessa, had asked him about, you know, capitalization and proper nouns of some things that are not capitalized and some things that are. So I kind of want to go back to that now and kind of listen to his answer again.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. That's the cool thing about the fact that we had them on. Like, as you guys listen to this episode, listeners, we rarely address you, but hi, listeners. Yeah, go back to that interview and he, you know, the way he discusses these things. But I'm glad you pointed that out too. The capitalization in this poem.
Yeah. Did you guys want to go to the next one? White Folks is Crazy.
Yeah, sure.
Vanessa, you had mentioned that you had marked this one down, but I can't remember if you said you had strong lines from it.
Well, the last 3 lines I think are pretty strong.
Could you read them?
Sure. Well, I'll start from like page 33,
but also
like the last context, 2 lines.
I think it's important to know that we have these 2 friends here sitting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. Sometimes I want to introduce the context. Through a window, right? Yeah, they see a white guy wearing shorts in the cold weather.
Yeah,
and that's pretty much the whole kind of the point of the discussion.
Yeah.
You know, and it starts off lighthearted, kind of jokingly, right?
Yeah.
And of course, in a again another turn, it points out another reality, which is, I think, your line, right, Vanessa?
Yeah. Well, I guess we could talk about the earlier lines of the poem also. I think it's funny that they mentioned that they're wearing pajamas under their jeans. And then they see this guy wearing shorts and they're like, I feel cold just looking at him. Yeah. Which is a phrase that I heard a lot. I feel it just looking at them. Like, that phrase is something I heard a lot growing up. And then I guess, well, they look back at the TV and it kind of ends up with them saying, on second thought, white folks on TV kill people every day and they don't seem to feel a thing. And so it's kind of like this idea of like white people don't really feel things.
Yeah, I mean, the contrast, right, of like you were saying that, you know, they got to feel cold, you know, by dressing like that. But here, like you were saying, Richie, it turns dark, right, and it becomes about the cold-blooded nature,
even the apathy
as well. Yeah. And
yeah, I mean, I think this is a way of connecting to the previous poem once again, where, you know, even just in this normal casual conversation, or not conversation, interaction, in the terms of just passing someone on the street, that you know, this apathy can be a very dangerous thing. In fact, when I teach Ellie Weasel's Night, one of my writing journals that I do is I have my students reflect on a quote from Weasel, and it's he talks about the opposite of love. Have you guys heard that quote or read it?
I think I have, yeah.
He says the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. You know, and in these contexts of, again, in these all these poems, he's building up the way in which racism is systemic, you know, in which you have whites over people of color in the form of police killings and their economic realities, and understanding the rage that goes behind this reality for so many people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and kind of what you're hinting at is that it doesn't even have to be literal. You know, like they don't literally have to shoot someone. I think it can also be systemic, you know, by denying benefits or, you know, denying a certain job, denying housing, you know, a lot of the structural racism that we've talked about
Yeah.
Is another way of, you know, killing minorities.
Yeah. And I think that's a very important discussion on race to be had, especially in the context of this book and these poems, because I think that if you were to have, you know, I'm sure this happens to Jose when he reads this book and read it in public readings.
Mm-hmm.
That well, actually, the next poem I think would be the poem, right? And I know we could talk about that first, but there's a line there. Once again, another turn, another shift that I feel people wouldn't be happy with. But I think, like I said, all the previous poems leading up to that line build up this case here of why he says this line, and why it's necessarily not wrong, because it's supposed to point out this indifference. But I'm kind of getting ahead of ourselves because it kind of ties into the next poem, and I know Vanessa, you want to talk about it, but I don't know if we're done with this one just yet. Are we?
Yeah, I think I think that's a good transition for it.
Go ahead, Vanessa.
So the next one.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, man. So the next one is another continuation of Mexican Heaven. So this is going to be the 5th part of Mexican Heaven. I think this one's my favorite to have him read, like in person, like this verse, because he pauses and he kind of like he does laugh sometimes. So I think it's probably one of my favorite stanzas that he reads. I don't know how to transition from that.
Maybe do you want to just read it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can read it. Okay. There are white people in heaven too. They build condos across the street and ask the Mexicans to speak English. I'm just kidding. There are no white people in heaven.
That was a good in the spirit of Jose.
Yeah.
I actually really do love the way I really love the way he reads this one too.
I was nervous.
In public. He definitely has a way of delivering that line. Like you said, Vanessa. I'm just kidding. There are no white people in heaven.
Yeah.
And that's a line that, you know, can be very polemic. But, you know, that's really the point I was just trying to make, is that this is something that I think he's drawing attention to in the previous poems, this issue of race, and why he says a line like this, something like this.
Yeah, exactly. You know, because it is kind of that volta, right? That turn that we had talked about in his poems here of, you know, you feel, you know, it's kind of like a basketball game, right? Like you feel you're going one way, but all of a sudden, you know, someone comes right behind you and like steals the ball from you, right? And so I kind of feel like this is what he does, you know, that's very effective. And the humor also, you know, I think is something that it's a dark humor in a way.
Oh yeah.
But I think it's also lighthearted, you know, because like he had said in the interview, he wrote this, you know, for with an immigrant in mind, you know, and I think audience, kind of what you were saying, Richie, I can't remember when you said it, but you said it once, you know, that audience is always very important when it comes to like what you're writing. Um, and so I think that in itself, if we think about the how it fits into the whole of the other Mexican heavens we've seen, I think it's interesting in terms of, well, this is the heaven that is heaven to a lot of Mexican immigrants, right? Because like there's no justification from the condos, and Mexicans can speak Spanish without feeling like they're going to be ousted for speaking their home language.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you also have, for such a short poem, I mean, that's also a thread to pull on, is the whole speak English debate, right? Again, there's no national language, right? But there are certainly people who would make you feel that way.
Yeah.
And I in preparation, before we actually interviewed Jose, I went on YouTube and was watching some of his readings. And so one was actually at a high school, I think. And so he read this one. Later in the Q&A, he actually did have a student like ask him, "Hey, why'd you say that? There's no white people," and they took offense to it. And I think Jose pretty much mentioned what we've been talking about, is that, I mean, first of all, yes, it is, it's supposed to be lighthearted, more of a joke, a dark humor kind of thing. But in the sense, it's not, because of course the whoever asked the question was like, well, what if I said like there are no Mexicans in heaven, and so he mentioned, well, in terms of racial politics, it's a little different, because you have the hegemony, you have, again, the larger structural system that's I think being addressed here, and it does make a lot of people uncomfortable, especially obviously a lot of white people, because I think we all hear this when people also criticize the whole idea of white privilege, when they say, "Oh, I'm white. Where's my privilege?" But I think the point about it is that it's something you don't even realize is there.
Right.
So I thought that was my bad. I thought that was an interesting thing that I observed during this video I saw.
Yeah, I want to watch that now.
Yeah, I can't remember which video it was, but I mean, if you just look up, Jose Olivarez reading, it's one where he's like on an auditorium like stage.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. Cool.
But the Q&As are like at the end of the video.
Right. And Vanessa, you had mentioned that this was one of your favorite, in terms of the seeing it live. But what else did you like about it?
Well, I like that it's a smaller piece of like a bigger whole poem. I like that it's split up throughout the collection, like by stanzas. I also like that it's like, it is lighthearted. Like it's not like a serious, or it's not so serious. Like there are serious elements to it, but it's not completely like serious.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of that tongue-in-cheek humor that, the implication, of course, is that, they're in hell, right? And so that kind of does make it dark, but to a believer. But I think it's just like Richie was saying, it's one way of looking at the inequalities and injustices of, like if there's something that they've done that is wrong, to a whole people, right? Whether it's immigrants or minorities in general, African Americans, it's etc. Then it's something that there's punishment for that to Mexican immigrants, brings about that comfort, and that's why I think that this poem works so well, when it's delivered live and with an audience, because there is that kind of, like if you're not following along, if you've never heard the poem, if you don't have it, you're kind of misled, and so there is kind of that relief that comes in with the last couplet. The one that I had next was poem in which I become Wolverine, but this one to me was the most complex from this section. not just the second page that kind of turns it into like a dual columned poem that makes it readable in different ways. But even from the first page, the spacing, that in terms of its form, I think is interesting. And aside from that, to me naturally, and as I'm sure to you all as well, like I was drawing to the reference to El Paso. And of course, even though it's not a positive reference, I think it's a reality, that ICE does conduct raids here, as they do in other immigrant communities. And so that, jumped out at me. And, it's referenced as well, the ICE officers in a couple of stanzas below about cubs ready to bite. And so I really like in this one the imagery of the claws and animalistic imagery referencing Wolverine, which kind of comes to a head, on page 38, where I don't know if any of you had marked, when the allusion to Wolverine, becomes, I know my rage is a poison. I know it kills me first, and still I love it and feed it. I mean, I can see it like the last scene of a movie. And to me, Wolverine, always stood out as an anti-hero, and someone who was very conflicted and was indeed full of rage. But the ideal ghost was that Professor X kind of tamed him, and the rage that we see here, is the recognition of like how they're being subjugated, they're being oppressed, and their people are dying. Their people are being taken by ICE, detained, and of course, it's even worse now under this presidency. And there's of course, still kids being detained. And just like today, I was hearing about how kids were being transported through the airport, being exposed to the virus potentially. So I feel, the idea of rage is something that, of course, is very prototypical of what minorities feel, but how the speaker here, realizes that just like the Invisible Man, it's something that can kill him. So that's what I really liked about it. Like just like Wolverine, the idea that if you don't control it, it is a poison to you, and it is a poison to your community if you give into that, because someone might shoot you or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean this poem is to me one of the top in the entire book, and the fact that it's powerful. I think it really does pack a punch, in the sense, first of all, in which again he sets up this larger picture of how the government is implicit in these actions. And I guess first of all, my thoughts go to in this time of COVID-19 and the pandemic of these people still detained, these children and families separated. This is still here, and man, it's really heavy thinking about them. And you mentioned the reference to El Paso. And I've driven by several instances of raids, and it is rage inducing a little bit, especially to see the human reaction to it, I guess. I remember one time I was leaving Power at the Pass, and it's over in Central for those of you guys who are listening, and driving up Piedras. It was a very interesting scene where there was a truck there pulled over almost in the middle of the intersection, and someone was being detained. I think the driver, and you had his family broken down and crying and yelling, and that was very hard to see. and not, the idea of not feeling something during that is a scary thing, where it makes me believe in monsters that don't look like monsters but like humans. um and I just think in the beginning he kind of talks about, even in the world, he talks about bombs punctuate every day like a period, talking about watching the news, and not just economic disaster but global disasters, right? He talks about global warming, and
Yeah.
I think what also gets me is when he kind of starts to, as you mentioned, the poem slowly pulls apart from each other. And there's this
Mm.
ideology here of creating an enemy out of immigrants, right? And he does this by, the speaker of the poem talks about this by creating abuelas into these dangerous people, right? Knives in their braids, knives in their hips. A children's song becomes invasion orders, and it's this very scary and real reality. Like when I don't like to spend a lot of time on Facebook, but when I see like articles put up, oh man, I read some of the comments people put. It's very, very scary, and it's like these are real
Mm-hmm.
people saying these things. You know, sana sana kulita rana. We all know that as a healing saying, right? But that becomes an invasion
Mm-hmm.
order, right? An ICE officer is ready to bite the hands of a fourth grader. Uh, and again, the rage becomes this embodied in the image of Wolverine, this fighter here. And as the poem splits up on the page, we all know where this is going, where it's going, where you see he brings in the police, the cops, right? And we all know how it ends. Roll credits. So just, again, I'm sorry for talking so much, but there is so much to talk about and unpacking these poems once again. So, I mean, I'm gonna stop there just because I I feel like I'm rambling and getting very emotional and a little bit angry while talking about this.
No, not you didn't ramble at all, and I think you made a lot of good points.
Mhm.
Uh, Vanessa, what did you think of this one?
I mean, I feel like you guys hit all of the points, Richie especially. um, there's one line that stood out to me, or one stanza, I guess, towards the bottom of at the bottom of the page of 37,
Mm-hmm.
where it says, "My enemies aren't ugly faced crooks. They don't laugh while innocent die. They point and say how tragic, then go home to pet their cute dogs."
Damn.
And I kind of, you were saying earlier about like the Facebook comments that he sees, like it's people that aren't really trying to make changes in society. They're just like, oh, that's so
Mm-hmm.
terrible. And then they just continue on with their lives kind of thing. So I wanted to mention
Right.
that stanza, I think.
Yeah, the apathy that Richie had talked about earlier with the other poem, referencing Weasel and um, what's the worst kind? What's the opposite of love? Um, I think to me the second to last stanza right above yours is also interesting, because of the microaggressions and the way that, I mean, they're not even micro, I think it's kind of emphasized there. What is assimilation but living death? Right. And so the idea that, you are in a way losing yourself as in two words, in the sense that by assimilating, you're kind of turning your back on your people. Kind of goes back to the hate you give again. Um, but it's another way that, like you were saying, Richie, about the hegemony, um, in the sense of it's controlled by using this way of just enforcing the language, and it starts there. It doesn't have to start at like people, ICE officers, and ICE itself, only existing since 2003, just to give people perspective that, it's this relatively new agency. of Homeland Security that doesn't even have to start with the raids. It could start in the classroom, it could start in the streets, with those kinds of things that are not even necessarily micro, but just ways that people are made to feel different. And ultimately, like you were saying, Vanessa, that people point out the tragedy in it, but then don't even do anything about it. They're just kind of inert and, shut their homes.
Wow.
I think we all had Mexican American disambiguation on 41. And I think this is another one, where, like we were talking about the Jose performing, this is another one where I always enjoy him performing. And it's all one stanza. And I think it's very complex because of how it's kind of like I see it as like a domino effect. Like it starts by referencing his parents being Mexican, but then he brings up Mexican Americans and Chicanos, and he kind of just goes back and forth between those identities, because it's just the complexity, right? And hence the title of disambiguation. What stood out to you all in this one?
I noticed that this one does go from English to Spanish a lot more than the other ones did. Like there's specific phrases that he says.
Why do you think that is, the jumping between one language, one tongue and another?
I think it's just more representation of who he feels he is. And this idea of like having this Americanized version of himself, but also he still very much has these Mexican roots. You said it was more, you saw it as kind of like a domino effect, and I kind of saw it as more of like this back and forth of like these two cultures. Yeah.
The push and pull. Yeah.
To me, this is another like one of the strongest poems in the entire collection. And I related a lot to the opening poem and the title of the book, Citizen Illegal, which again, it brings up the concept of identity, and that's identity tied into self-identity, how we identify ourselves, and even more so how there's a discrepancy between that and how other people see us, right? It's a lot of and again, a lot of that has to do with coming from different backgrounds, and even then, right, depending on where you're at, people will call you different things. And he references this to his parents, even though they call themselves Mexicanos, right? In Mexico, right, they're referred to something else, right? And even he brings up this concept of Chicano, right, and what Chicano means. And I think something that I think is pretty interesting is how he idealizes this concept of Chicano. And so for those of you who are listening and Chicano studies classes, for example, right, it's such an interesting concept, right? But it's all about that kind of generational gap and reconciling with previous generations of our backgrounds. I identify as Chicano, but I think it's interesting how an aspect of that is the fancy college degrees, as he calls it, right? And a few tattoos. I think it's really interesting. Today, Ben Signs on Facebook, there's Facebook again, right? He actually made a very interesting post. It was National Siblings Day. And so a lot of people were posting pictures with their siblings and leaving some thoughts. So in Ben's post, he posted a photo of his two younger brothers, which, by the way, they have a crazy family resemblance, right? But his post was talking about how growing up he was told he's not Chicano, or not even growing up, but like how now he's told he's not Chicano enough, and what that means, and he says he doesn't apologize for going to a good school, right, and learning and all that. But he says if anyone ever questions me, I show them this picture of my brothers, and they're it's family resemblance, but they're wearing bandanas and longer hair, and I just when I read this, I thought of that post right away because it was fresh in my mind. But talking about again the disambiguation, I think that you guys, how'd you guys all describe it? So dominoes, how'd you describe it, Vanessa?
Like a push and pull kind of thing.
Oh, push and a pull. Okay. Oh, I really like that. Yeah. I was gonna say it's like a cascading into chaos, of identity. But I really like how he draws the parallels of even how he talks about the two are cousins, meaning that they're not the same, but they're closely related, right? He talks about that with the American Dream and the phrase royally effed. I'm not going to say the word because I don't want to, it's a podcast. We want everyone to hear it. But he has that line, right? Royally effed should not be confused with the American Dream, although the two are cousins. And I think it all leads up to this idea of again, how of identity ending with what the government calls non-white Hispanic or white Hispanic, who parents call mijo, even when I don't come home so much. So again, a lot of it has to do with place as well and who's observing. Right now we're all dealing with the 2020 census, and I think in my parents call me mijo, so in the end he's mijo, and which I kind of like. He brings it back home.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, that was a rambling mess again. I'm so sorry.
No. I mean, it kind of just like you were seeing the cascading chaos or the beautiful confusion, you could say, is very true, right? Because it does pivot on the point of view, whether it's the academia or the familia or themselves, right? Of whether they're going to be called diverse, whether they're going to be just, called gringos because they're Americanized Mexicans, or whether they're going to be, in his case, Chicano, which, like you were saying, has a lot of different definitions, and in this case, it's kind of a, it's the way it's interpreted, right, is kind of still something that is elitist, right, because it's a fancy college degree. So I think, like you were saying, those who are listening in a Chicanx course, there's a lot of different ways of interpreting the Chicanx movements and a Chicanx identity, and even just removing the CH and replacing it with the X and making it gender neutral so that it's not a no, right? But it's just an X is there as well. Goes back to, to the schism of the Chicano movement with Gloria and Zaldúa, and how women, weren't really recognized in that movement, and how there's a lot of machismo as well within the Chicano movement, by some different ways. So I think that is what makes this a poem that represents just all the complexities of identity mushed into one, right? And why it's so difficult for many, when it comes to the census, like you say there at the end, of just, well, who am I, right? Like, what am I? And how Remezcla has a great video on that. I don't know if y'all have seen it, but they have a great video on the census and why, it is kind of problematic Hispanic, in that regard.
Right, is so strangling to a lot of people who might not identify that way. Right?
Exactly. Vanessa, were there any lines that you related to or that you found interesting in of themselves?
At the beginning, I liked when it says, I am a Chicano from Chicago, which means I'm a Mexican American with a fancy college degree and a few tattoos, which I think we already touched on. And I think that kind of comes in and out throughout the poem. He mentions it a couple of times. The food, the idea of food in this one, I thought was interesting also. Towards the end of, towards the bottom of page 41. He wrote, Everything in me is diverse, even when I eat American foods, like hamburgers, which, to clarify, are American when a white person eats them, and diverse when my family eats them. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
I think the idea of college in this one also. The idea of putting, I guess, diverse people on the brochures to showcase that the university is diverse was interesting.
Right.
And I think the way that this kind of ties into all of the previous poems and the idea of like being a good Mexican son and what it is to be Mexican American.
Yeah, like juggling all that, you know, whether it's like placating what your parents want in you, and your parents themselves, you know, in this case the parents are undocumented, you know, and so that kind of is a whole thing unto itself. And how there's that undue burden, right, that is referenced in the other poem about how the quote unquote good Mexican son is seen as like the salvation, right, the solution to the sacrifices, you know, that the parents had made because they're undocumented to come here for the American dream, is something that now the onus is on the you know, the college, the goer here, and which is true of many, you know, immigrants and many many first generation immigrants. So I think it's a really interesting way of representing all that, and the chaotic nature of like, well, how do I succeed in academia while remaining true to my you know, to my roots and to my culture, you know, even in something like you said about the food that he chooses to eat, you know. And I think goes back to that taco, the I mean, not taco, but the Crunchwrap Supreme that is, you know, the Mexican is folded into in the other poem, that, you know, us who are identify as Mexican or Mexican American, you know, it's not even a burrito, right? It's a crunch wrap. And so even the identity of it as a Mexican food staple is taken away. You know, so
yeah, no,
you know, I don't know.
I was just laughing how people
Bell,
call it wraps. God forbid you call it a burrito.
Yeah. Right. There's a great YouTube video about it. I don't know if you have seen, but you know, someone who made a parody of Tim James running for governor of Missouri or something, and someone made a parody because he wanted people to speak English, or like English only driver's license exams, and someone made a great parody of like how they were going to turn everything into English, you know, so even like Starbucks, venti and all that was going to turn into like small, medium, small, large, and middle, or something like that.
I have to check it out.
Yeah, it's really funny. Yeah, I show it to my classes, you know, as a way of talking about language and how people can have bad intentions, even though they might seem like they are really just trying to make it for economic reasons. You know, so that's the end of the third section.
Wow, it's a lot.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode discussing Citizen Illegal by José Olivarez. And if you haven't read it, we hope we inspire you to pick up a copy. Literally Literary is brought to you by the Mellon Foundation through the Humanities Collaborative at EPCC and UTEP. Follow us on Instagram at literallyliterary.ep and on Twitter at literallylitep.